Andrew Mathis is an engineer who volunteers his time to design sustainable food forests.
This is the St. Mary's Community Food Forest, and this is a project that we've been working on over the last year and a half to develop a space where anyone can come in and harvest food for themselves and their families. And we've really done this to combat food insecurity in our community. Food insecurity is a huge issue, not only in our community, but all across the world. And through COVID and the recent inflation, there's more and more people that are having trouble affording just food that they need to survive. Food forests are collections of perennial plants, so that is plants that come back every year and don't need to be reseeded, like trees and shrubs, that not only grow food and medicine and lumber for people, but also provide for each other. So the main difference between annuals and perennials is that annuals you have to plant from seed every year if you want to harvest, whereas perennials you only have to plant once. With this cherry tree here, the cherries, we planted the tree once, and now every year we'll get cherries off of it until it dies of old age at like 30 or 40 years old. So we can get a lot more harvest while minimizing the disturbance to the ground, because every time we disturb the ground, we're risking soil erosion and losing our topsoil, which is extremely valuable. In industrial agriculture, we can have acres and acres that are just a single crop, and this actually produces a huge risk where if the season is not favorable, we could lose an entire crop. What we try to do differently in a food forest is we try to diversify what we're growing so that if one thing fails one year, it's okay because other things will do better. In industrial agriculture, we usually introduce nitrogen as an artificial fertilizer that is chemically derived. And when we add this to the soil, it can seriously disrupt the soil microbiology. And we become dependent on it because as you add the nitrogen, you get spikes of different populations in the soil microbiology, and eventually you end up killing the soil and everything that lives in it. And what we do in permaculture to replace that, because nitrogen is still a very important part of growing plants, we have nitrogen fixing plants that form a symbiotic relationship with specific bacteria. And these bacteria can fix nitrogen out of the air and put it into the soil. Insecticides are very harmful in a food forest because we have both good and bad insects. And to just wipe out all of the insects altogether is actually not a great strategy, because the next year we'll actually see more populations grow, usually of the more harmful insects. One group of insects we want to actually attract to the food forest are predators. So these are different predators that eat pests of the food forest. So one pest that is pretty common is aphids. And one thing that we can plant is yarrow, and yarrow can actually attract hoverflies and other kinds of predatory insects like ladybugs that can lay eggs, and their young will eat these aphids. One important group of plants that we have in the food forest are called dynamic accumulators. So these are plants that can mine the soil for different nutrients, and they bring it up into their leaves. And when those leaves die back at the end of the season, those nutrients are made available for other plants that are in the area. So one example of these dynamic accumulator plants is red vein sorrel. And it's also a perennial vegetable that is edible. Swales are an idea that allow us to regulate the water on a site. So what we do is we can have a ditch that allows water to collect so that after a rainfall, we don't have all the water just flowing off the site. We can have a place for it to collect and sit and slowly infiltrate into the ground, and have trees that are planted on the mound adjacent in order to take advantage of that additional water. And this allows us to not have to constantly irrigate and add more water over time because we have water on the site already. In food forests, we like to promote a fungal-dominated soil. The mycelium that is the main body of what we call mushrooms. Mushrooms are the fruiting body that appear above ground, but the main body of the mycelial networks are underground, and they can actually form relationships with the roots of our perennial plants. And these relationships can actually extend the reach of the plant's roots by between 10 to 1,000 times. And so these plants are able to tap into a much larger area of soil and get the nutrients from that soil. And so in a food forest, when we try to encourage this, what we do is we lay down wood chips and fungally dominated compost. Wind protection is a really important aspect when you're planning where to put a food forest. So one thing that we want to do is we want to limit the winds, especially from the north, which come through the winter. And the reason behind that is that these winds can reduce the growth of our plants by stressing them out. So we were lucky when we did this food forest location here that we have this large bank of white pine and white oak that you see behind me. When we're planting the food forest plants, we have to disturb the soil. And anytime we disturb the soil, we are mixing up the top layer of soil, which contains this kind of native seed bank. And this native seed bank is all the seeds that have just landed on the soil over the last duration that it hasn't been disturbed, and they start to germinate. And we can either force whatever we want to grow there by seeding it directly after disturbing the soil, or we can just let it grow up and see what comes up. And that's what we did here. Once we dug these swales, we let the soil regrow whatever different weeds, we would say, were there. But these are all plants that come up, and their primary role is to prevent erosion. So anytime there's disturbed soil, they grow very quickly in order to hold on to that soil and not let it wash away. And that's a big problem. Having soil erosion reduces our ability to grow food all around the world. So sustainability asks us to minimize our impact. We're talking about our carbon footprint. How do we make that smaller? But when we start to take that to extremes, it doesn't look very pretty. So it's important, I think, that we start to shift the conversation from the paradigm of sustainability to the paradigm of regeneration. We don't want to have this kind of neutral impact of this not impacting the ability of future generations to meet their needs. We want to have a positive impact. So regeneration looks more at how do we meet the needs of the present while improving the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And I think a food forest is a great example of that. This is a way to improve the future while meeting our own needs in the present.